jump to you.
There's an old story of Mulla. Now we know that Mulla was a very great mystic, but he was also human and prone to moods. And one day, after a hard day sitting at the coffee shop, he went home in rather a petulant mood. When he got into the house, there was his wife sweating over the pot of rice pilaf, and the donkey was braying outside. So Mulla came in and said, "Woman, feed the donkey." Well, she turned on him, didn't she? "Don't you know I've been washing and cleaning all day and here I am? You go and feed the donkey." They got into a big fight. And finally, the Mulla, wanting to be a little bit conciliatory, said to her, "Well, look, whoever speaks first has to feed the donkey." So they went into silence. And the wife was stirring her pilaf, and the Mulla went over and sat down, arms crossed. But you know how women are. She got a bit tired of this silence, so she decided to go over to the neighbour's house to have a little bit of a chat. So Mrs. Mulla went off, and there was the Mulla sitting there in his chair, and the night came down. Well, as it happened, a couple of robbers came by, and they came into the house, and they started to take all the furniture and everything in the house. And then one of them noticed the Mulla sitting there. They got a start, but then they realized he was sitting there like a robot and not doing or saying anything, so they just went on taking the furniture and the drapes and everything. And one of the robbers was a bit of a trickster and a jester, and so he went over with a smile on his face and he took off the Mulla's turban too. Anyway, they cleaned out the whole house, didn't they? Well, in the meantime, Mrs. Mulla felt a bit sorry for her husband, so she sent the neighbour's son over to him with a bowl of soup. So when the little boy came in, there was a Mulla sitting there with his arms crossed, and then the Mulla gesticulates, look what they've done. And then he points to his head to say, "Look, they even took my turban." So the poor little boy didn't know what the Mulla was saying. He thought he wanted, so he went over and tipped the bowl of soup on the Mulla's head. There's a Mulla sitting there with his arms crossed. And the little boy went back and told the Mulla's wife what was going on. Well, of course, did she come back in a hurry, and she said, "How could you let this happen? You haranguing him." Well, he got up off his chair, pulling himself up to his full height, with bits of noodle hanging off his bald head. And he said, "Woman, you see what your stubbornness has done? And you spoke first, now go and feed the donkey." You know, there was this king of Nashipur, and he woke up one morning and the sun was shining and the birds were singing and tweeting outside, and he was in such a good mood. It all looked so wonderful outside and he was feeling good inside. And then his servant walked in with his cup of goat's milk that he had first thing in the morning, and the king said, "Oh, what a beautiful day it is. Look at the sun shining and the birds singing." And the servant rather woodenly looked at him and nodded and, "Yes, sire," and off he went. And when the servant got back to the kitchen, he said, "King's in a good mood for the moment." And the cook said, yes. Yesterday morning he said my pancakes were the best pancakes in the world, and then at night time he told me my soup was tasteless and that I wasn't worth a cook's backside. So, you know, they commiserated with one another about the moods of their king, that they never knew what they were going to find from one minute to the next. But anyway, on this day, he was in quite a good mood, so of course, as was the usual pattern, he got his 12 advisors around him to discuss the matters of the court and things that had to be dealt with as kingdoms do. And each of these ministers, in a most ingratiating manner, bowing, sire, couching all of their presentations with all of these flowery sayings about how good the king was and so forth. And he was listening to all of this, as he had to listen to every day. And then the Minister of Finance, after the other ministers had spoken, said, "Sire, none of this is possible. We don't have enough money." And then he gave a long present. Well, the king thought, yes, he's definitely got a point, and it immediately turned his mood. So immediately he got into a petulant, peeved state, and everybody knew it, of course, because the face changed and the demeanor changed, and he dismissed them all peremptorily, "Get out, or I've heard enough now." So as the king was getting up from his throne, he happened to walk past the doorway leading into the garden, and two of the ministers had sat down on a little bench by the pool there, and they were commiserating with one another, saying, "It's a wonder we can get anything done, because this king only works on his moods and his emotions. How can you get anything done when he's swinging from one thing to another?" And the king overheard this, and it was like someone kicked him in the stomach. And he started to have a little bit of contemplation. And he did contemplate, the things that he'd done and the way he operated. And then he suddenly had the realization that under all of his moods and all of his manners was the thought, but I want to be a good king. I want to be fair. I want to do the right thing for my people. He said to himself, it must be something physical. So he called a doctor. And the doctor comes along and examining, he said, "You're in perfect health." "No," said the king, "there's something wrong." Well, the doctor said, "May I tell you, sire, that there's nothing physically wrong with you. It's your spirit that is the problem. I suggest that you try to find something to focus on, something that will give you something to contemplate on." And so the king decided that he would call the imam. So he called the imam, and the imam said, "Well, my suggestion, sire, is that you go to the cemetery. You go and sit amongst the graves, and there you can contemplate, and it will bring you back to a point of I don't have time to go to the cemetery." He says to the imam, "How can I take time out from looking after my kingdom to go and sit in the cemetery every time I get a mood and I want to find myself again?" So the imam got a little bit conciliatory to her, and he said, "Well, why, you've got a lot of learned pundits in your kingdom. Why don't you call them around and get their advice about what it is that you should do?" So the king gathers around him all of these learned scholars and pundits and so forth. Well, after a little time they all got into argument amongst themselves about what it was that the king should do and how it should be done. And well, the king was sitting there while they all started to bandy around with their opinions and he finally gave it all up. He walked out of the room and left them to it. So he walked off into his garden, which he did from time to time, but rather rarely. And he was sitting down also by a bench by the pond when it so happened his old gardener who'd been in his employ for decades, happened to come along and see him sitting there on the bench, and after giving the usual salutations to the monarch, he said, "Sire, it seems that you're troubled. Won't you tell me about it?" And of course the king unloaded to the old gardener all that had been going on. He said, "I left them all to it and not giving me." And the old gardener said, well, if you don't mind my telling you, sire, he said, you know, many years ago in my youth, I was working for a merchant who was very, very wealthy. He had farms and warehouses and all, and in my youthful exuberance I said to him and congratulated him on everything that he had. And that old merchant, you know, he said to me, he said, no, my son, beware. There are 4 words that I can give you that will allow you to understand what I'm saying. And the old gardener said, you know, after some time, that merchant lost all his warehouses, he lost his farms, and he was poor, and I met him again, and he was wearing ragged clothing, and I spoke to him again, and I commiserated with him about his situation. And you know, this merchant gave me the same 4 words that he'd given to me when I was in my youth. Perhaps those 4 words would help you. And so the old gardener gave the 4 words to the king. And yes, said the king, that's so simple, he thought to himself. And he went back into his palace, where the advisors and the pundits were all still arguing about what he should do and what was the thing that he should concentrate on. And the king said, I've got it. I have 4 words, and that's all I need. Go. So he dismissed them all. And then he concentrated on those 4 words. He even had a ring made in which those 4 words were engraved, and he had it on his finger to remind him whenever he got into a mood or he got caught in the emotions of this is good and this is bad, this is right and this is wrong. And after that his kingdom flourished, and his servants no longer had to worry about his mood swings. What are those 4 words that the king learned?
This too shall pass.
You bet.
I was thinking everything is impermanent.
Yes.
It's not 4 words.
Yes, it is.
I will be done.
Yes. We find our own words inside, don't we? We were sitting on Tuesday having this discussion, and I was telling those who were there that, you know, over these last days and with the visitations that have taken place, it's been the same pattern. And it's cyclical. It comes round for us. The same energetic that's around at the moment. And we know those cycles go on. We know we have moods. What is it, or where is it? Like these words that bring us back to what is now that we've found, that which is unchanging and permanent, as opposed to the impermanent and the changing. How fortunate we are. How blessed we are. And for each of us we might have different words that come up. Some of us might say this too shall pass, or everything is impermanent, or everything is God, or whatever. But it does the same thing, doesn't it? Even this, as I explained, we can put our hand here and immediately it's there. I mean, really, you know, in these past years where these alms were given out, and these alms were only to remind you who you are. Because when you touch that alms, you're remembering. Now we don't need the alms anymore, and maybe we still do this. Do you see what I mean? And in these times, we need that. But for each of us, it can be different. Some of us will put our hands here, some of us will have those words, "Thy will be done. This too shall pass," or whatever it is. But if you haven't got that, you better find it. Because in these days where these energies now are so intense, it can swing us, pull us, take us out into fear and doubt and all of those things. We're just going to get caught with that that's abounding outside. What is this that we know is unchanging? We can't touch it, but we can remind ourselves of it with the words and the movement, isn't it? What are they for you? What is it that's so effective that in an instant you can be back in it? And I was telling of my own experience. Over all of my years, from 16 years up until meeting Divine Mother at 46, yoga was my thing. I did it religiously every day, wherever I was in the world. That was my anchor. But, you know, as soon as I did the salute to the sun, I was gone. Off with the fairies, out of here. So I realized that that was a vice. It was no different from having 4 glasses of vodka or smoking pot. That was my vice. It was a cop-out. Because I had a reminder. Because, you know, since I've been feeling better, I've gone back to doing yoga. And there it is again. As soon as I do the salute to them, oh, bye. But it's no longer a vice, as it was then. But I realize now it was. So what's the difference? Because then it was a cop-out. I knew that as soon as I did that, it all disappeared. It was like, oh, okay.
Now you don't want anything to disappear.
That's right.
Everything is how it is.
That's right.
So you don't need.
You don't need it. And yet, it's the same effect. Immediately, it puts you in that place. Except there's nowhere to go now. You see the difference? Before there was the dimensions, I wanted to get out of this. So we can look back on our life and we can realize that there's been an awareness, a thread, all along, hasn't it? A knowingness all along. Something there. We might have considered it to be a vice, you know. It might have been coming home after a hard day and sitting down having a smoke or whatever, glass of wine or whatever it is. But what did it do? It immediately, isn't it? What is it for us now? We're here, intensely here. And yet, we do have that can bring us back to that remembrance. What is it for you?
There's nowhere to go, nothing to do.
Yes.
I actually get excited about seeing life unfolding around me. You know, it's a buzz to see how the emotions, being aware of the emotions and how we interact with each other and watching things happen.
You bet. You bet it is.
To be.
It sure is. Yes. Absolutely.
I don't want to get away from it.
No. No.
It's a bit like between movement and stillness, the consciousness is moving.
Yes, right.
And whenever it moves too close to the movement, it's caught into it, and then as it goes back,
Yes.
it's coming out. But whether it's here or here, it's the same. It's just
Absolutely right. And yet we had a pendulum that could swing like that, from that state of bliss which took you out of it into, isn't it? Where does it rest? Thank you.